It has always been my opinion that the 1954 film Gojira is a tapestry of national traumas on developed film. A sort of giant exhale of different stresses of the time, contradicting and working in tandem with one another. In all honesty, I believe a million different readings are possible and even encouraged. So many different essays exist on what this movie is about, ranging from cultural clashes, war, nuclear arms, family, and the implications of scientific advancement. Being totally honest, I feel poorly equipped to review it. Simply, it's a monolith of kaiju cinema and a piece of insider art that deeply reflects its time. A movie that made legends both in and out of its own fictional universe. But I'll give it a solid go and see what comes up. To be clear, this movie is utterly serious, an emotional human drama, framing the monster as a disaster that the principal characters need to contend with and debate the solution to, rather than realistically get rid of. The issue presented to us is that there really isn't a solution, at least not a simple one, so we can only watch helplessly as this monster takes lives and levels Tokyo. The monster makes landfall in Tokyo twice during this movie, and both scenes are spectacular, with fantastic shots that become staples of the series. Godzilla lifting the train with his mouth, destroying the Guyot building, burning whole streets with nuclear fire, all of it is so impressive that you almost forget you're watching a movie. On that note, the destruction is perfectly done, with peerless effects, puppetry that amazes, and the Shodai Goji suit with its incredible model work, its bumps, sores, its face. The miniatures without any comparison in the industry at the time, almost looking like a real cityscape. I would say there are maybe 7 seconds of this film that don't look incredible, and that's stressing that point rather heavily. The score to this film is, as expected, fantastic. From the movie's catchy main theme that would later become Goji's personal theme, to the storm on Odo Island's peril and the absolute menace of Godzilla comes ashore. The way this movie reuses its music is also something to note. Prayer for Peace playing over the ending sequence is a particularly powerful example, and many of the pieces of audio throughout this movie would become series staples in their own right. One thing I want to point out in each of these films is my favorite piece of destruction, tactless as it may be. In this film, it's the reveal of the heat ray, also known as the atomic breath, which is personally what I prefer to call it. It's the moment where Gojira ceases to be an enlarged animal common to this era of monster movies and becomes what can only be called a dragon. The prayer for peace sequence that happens after the second landing is utterly heart-stopping. I believe it would shock a drunk sober, and honestly, it's hard to sit through, and I mean that in the best way possible. The film has multiple main characters that we follow throughout, and all of them are connected. My personal bet for the actual protagonist, if you could say this film even has one, would be Emiko. Her perspective, position between the other main characters, and choices that she makes are pivotal to this film's climax. In a more central position to the main plot is her father, Professor Yamane. His impossible pacifism rings very deep. He's morally right in the fact that study of Gojira is wise and merciful and probably the best idea, but unfortunately this monster cannot be contained. At the same time, he's also logically right in his reasoning that the monster cannot be destroyed by conventional means, which adds some weight to his protests towards the government and military's single-minded focus on killing the beast. Contrast this with Ogata. He's the working-class man of the cast and seems to represent the public perspective, wanting a quick solution over philosophical notions, which naturally brings him into conflict with Yamane, which is given even more tension considering his relationship with Emiko. At an interesting crossroads in this conversation is Dr. Serizawa. He's the one person on Earth with the means to obliterate the monster, but who suffers with the understanding of that implication. His costume is interesting to me. He seems quite young, but is a scarred veteran wearing a lab coat that just looks a bit too large on him. It feels like the war took more from him than just his eye. Perish the thought of mentioning Serizawa in this film without talking about the oxygen destroyer. It's compared directly to nuclear bombs, but notably does not replace them in the film's narrative. It's an entirely different horror, and a slow build-up is added to it, with half of a reveal, I guess, leaving us to question its true power until we understand the force it possesses. It's just perfection on the reel, honestly. Its place in the movie, both in terms of plot relevance and its extreme power as a sci-fi superweapon, deepens the already interesting contrast between the optimistic yet powerless Yamane and Serizawa, who has the ability to make change, but is paralyzed by his own fear of the consequences. Also, the news reporter Hagiwara is in the movie. Okay, I'm joking, but he doesn't have a page on the wiki despite being rather prominent in the events across the first half of the film. He's indirectly the reason that Emiko learns of the oxygen destroyer in the first place. It's just kind of funny that history has kind of forgotten his role in the film. I think my favourite part overall is that this movie simply takes its time. It holds on shots for dramatic effect, it pans wide and isn't afraid of showing a meeting or two. It feels like a real crisis, where the issue can spiral at any time, yet we still need to take it all in. Despite the panic of the public, the film is paced in a curious and introspective way. The pacing is at its best during the ending sequence, the deployment of the oxygen destroyer leading into the painful and honestly rather sad death of the monster. A bittersweet resolution tinged with despair by the understanding that this may not be a one-time thing. The sequel and the box office numbers would set this grim prediction into stone. I love this movie. It's awesome to finally talk about it. I highly recommend, just not as your first Godzilla film. Its tone, while a massive standout for its quality, makes it a bit of an outlier among most of the series. Stick with something lighter to start. It's a masterpiece, but we all already knew that. On my personal rating scale, it gets a hybrid theory out of 10.